Well, if you look at based on the 2020 census, the MSA of Greenville, Malden, and Easley is an 842,000 residents. I know a lot of longtime Greenville people never thought they would see that day. And if you look at the comp plan through the county, they're expecting a plus of 220,000 new residents in the next 20 years. So we are quickly becoming a more of a minor market. One of the stats that I threw out last year, going through my old notes that I thought was interesting, is looking at who bought houses last year. And I found it interesting last year, and it's more so this year. The percentage of single women who bought homes more than doubled the amount of single men who bought homes.
Wow.
But yet 62% of all the home buyers last year were married couples. So a lot of different types of people are getting into the housing market. We're seeing the millennials really finally start to pour into the market about 10 years later than most of the experts anticipated. I think COVID probably had a lot to do with that. And so that's, between that and the lack of supply, the basic economics of supply and demand is why you're seeing very low inventory, increasing prices, generally frustrated first-time home buyers, especially. But it's important to understand that going into the market and knowing kind of where you're situated. And it's important for our industry to know who's buying, what are they buying, and what are our needs.
Yeah, some of the other things that that stuck out to me were, the typical home buyer in Greenville in the upstate area was 47 years old. They had a household income of about $96,500, which kind of makes sense if you're looking at, kind of our average pricing getting up there and close to over three now. That all makes sense. So when we look at, you said in our MSA area, 884,000 people,
842,817 to be exact.
Okay. And then a projected growth of 200,000+ more over the next 20 years. So we'll be 1 million people in this area.
That'll be a needed housing unit production of 88,000 new rooftops that we will need to just meet the demand.
Okay, so I think that bears repeating, so because that's a huge number. 88,000 homes needed over the next 20 years.
Right. Yeah, based on the population increase, some housing units becoming obsolete, needing replacing, but primarily the people entering the market. I mean, what we're seeing is the merging of the two biggest consumer groups in recent memory, and that's the boomers and the millennials, and they're merging in the middle. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is a lot of that middle types of housing is missing. And like you mentioned, townhomes. But a lot of our local zoning and codes and ordinances don't allow for a whole lot of creative housing. It's that our ordinances push everybody to a ranch on an acre or to multifamily, and there's a big missing middle that we see, and that's part of why we see such high demand and low inventory, because right now a lot of these boomers should be transitioning to one level master domain, smaller units, those kind of things, but they have nowhere to go, so they're holding on to their units, and those units are not filtering into the market. So it's kind of a gumbo of reasons of why we're seeing the market we're seeing.
Yeah, that phrase you used, the missing middle, and that's, I think, one of our biggest frustrations, in the real estate business that we see, is that there's just all this demand and then just no supply. And it really is kind of it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, it's almost like we created a lot of our local governments just through zoning and through their ordinances, and they've kind of created this monster. And I don't see any way out other than really getting creative over the next couple of years in terms of how housing is done. When you look at, for instance, if you were to want to have a house with an auxiliary dwelling unit in most parts of the upstate, you can't do that. I mean, you maybe want to have a house with a mother-in-law suite that's not attached. Our current zoning doesn't really allow for that. There's really not much creativity out there. So is this on our agenda to try to help educate county and city councils on how we can bridge this gap?
Absolutely. It's something that we've been talking about for a number of years. We actually, with some other groups, commissioned a study that brought in a consultant that specifically did a missing middle housing study, and they went through and they did an audit of our county codes, ordinances, zoning regulations, the city of Greenville as well, and they showed where the weaknesses were, where our barriers were preventing us from creating that different types of housing, and a lot of that housing is going to be infill. It's going to be in urban areas, urban core centers, infill lots, and you get pushback from when you try to fill in those lots from a lot of the surrounding neighbors because density is a bad word. They're fearful of the change of the character of their neighborhood. So one of the things we did in that study is we kind of showed how you can do density, you can do different types of housing